My dear friends, today I'd like to talk to you about the propaganda that is developing in our country to understand China. And basically, it takes two forms. Form number one, they're not telling you that China is different from the Muslim countries that where they are having a change from dictatorship into something that is democratic, though we don't know yet where that will all flow. Now, it is quite true that in China they have not developed many democratic forms, but there's another reason for it. Because in China, the central federal government is not the dominant political power in China. It never was under the emperor, and that was adopted by the Communist Party. The real political power and economic power has been in the peripheries, in the regions. And there's been a lot of corruption, which goes against the principle of the central government, because the central government had to dig out the corrupt people, which they have been doing regularly and haven't yet completed. So you have a situation in China which is not fully understood here. It is one in which in 30 years they began to build up industry into a formidable development and differently structured than the industries in the West. Although in the West they first developed industries based upon wage labor. And in China, as they developed it, sure, they were developing different economic sections in the country, but their economic sections are nowhere near like what the economic sections are in the Western capitalist countries. Why? Because they come out of feudalism and still have much of feudalism still there. And the human nature of people under feudalism tied to the land is quite different than the human nature of people who are free from the land and go out to get a job. And that's where the modern forms of democracy first came into being, and the demand for some kind of socialism, because there was a different kind of human relationship that developed, and a human quality that developed, because the question of privatization became a dominant force. Now, the question of privatization, they have to prevent from becoming the dominant force if they are to build a truly democratic country, because a truly democratic country has to give consideration to the majority of the people. And the majority of the people are the ones who are working and producing in industry. And they require that industry grow so that people can have jobs and get paid, and then there's a circulation and production continues on and continues to grow. And in China, it is very interesting that they have both privately owned corporations and socially owned corporations. And these are called the private sector and the social sector with social money. But the government uses its social capital even to help private enterprises if they develop high tech, because the ultimate objective of a socialism is to build up industry. Why? Because you're not going to take care of all the people if you don't build up industry that would have the capability of taking care of them. And that cannot happen under a capitalist system where there is a stymieing of growth, because the growth is determined on the basis of profitability, not on the basis of consumption of the people in the country. We have to understand that China is different, and so you get a lot of propaganda that's taken place with the events after the Egyptian eruption against dictatorship, and comparisons that China will be next. That's nonsense. You can't compare what the dictatorship that was under the domination of foreign capital, and the dictatorships were based upon the accumulation of private capital, which was developed in those countries and then shipped out of those countries in the names of those who were dictating. That is not the situation in China, even though they have corruption, where many of the local leaders have been making a lot of money. Some $90 billion was lost in China due to a lot of this corruption. But that's what they've been battling since 2005. But since 2005, they also have moved to develop a national trade union movement, but that didn't get going until 2010, early in 2010, because of what was happening in Foxconn, and young people were committing suicide. and the workers were beginning to erupt. And at that point, the national trade union movement that was established in 2005 for the first time began to have connection with the working people in the provinces. And when they first went down to help in early 2010, there were battles between the local labor leaders and the labor leaders that came in from the federal government. But they settled all that. And in 2010, things began to move differently. And it is the beginning, in my opinion, of real democracy, because I've been reading now for the last whole year on developments in the labor movement and how that brings together the production and the people in the country. So you have to look at China differently than you look at any other country. You have to see that, first of all, they don't use class in terminology. They want the different economic levels to work together harmoniously, because they recognize that one section is based on privatization, and the human character of people in that area have different contradictions because they are interested in only one thing, themselves, and that creates a problem for society. Then they have other sections with the government running a social plan for their development in the country, whereas that doesn't happen in capitalist countries, where each corporation makes up its own plan. So you have social economic planning, which again brings the private capital into a social form which does not exist in the West, and that's socialism, because both together, private and social, will build up the country and create things and create the substance upon which the working people will live, and the country will continue to grow. So you have the question of complexities in China of economic sections which in and of themselves have contradictions that are all showing up. But the government is moving along on planning how to deal with inflation, on planning how they got out of the economic crisis, which everybody knows that they did. They're not putting a lot of money into the military, just for defense. And now we know that. And that's why subtle things are now happening, where we are creating an atmosphere where they're beginning to have rumors on the internet in China, and to get the people who are interested in privatization to talk about democracy. Democracy based on privatization is not full democracy, because it's not economic democracy. But that is the process that's taking place right now in telling you about what's happening in China. And China is reacting to protect its government, protect its social and economic structure, and that is normal. And they have a right to do that. And if you ask me about oppression of people who want to keep the country going in the right direction for the masses, I think we are at the lowest level, and China is pretty high up in what they are doing to build up the country for taking care of people. We are not doing it. So that's my lesson for today. But next time we get together, I'll tell you more about it. And I've got to find a way to let you ask me questions, but we'll do that later on.